I also want to express my thanks and appreciation to Mayor Kovia for being here today, and it's such a pleasure for me to be back in Prague, where I've been once before and hope to come many, many times. You know, I watched Play the City, and I thought about what 3 words we would use to describe New York City, and certainly the 3 that I would use are diverse, innovative, and equitable. Although I give very high runner-up marks to the Yellow City for including the word sexy, which I have to say is something that all cities should be to some extent as well. I want to start by taking a look back. You know, New York was one of the original 13 colonies that ultimately, after gaining independence, became one of the 13 states of the United States. Now, the other 12 colonies, all along the eastern seaboard of the country, were settled mainly by the British, and all of them had established religions. New York was different. New York was established by a company. It was established by the Dutch East India Company, and its religion was business and making money, and everyone was welcome, and there was no religious test. And I'd say thus from the very creation of New York's ethos was based on diversity, on talent, and on making money. So even so, for the first 150 years of our existence, including more than a quarter of a century after the United States was formed, New York was neither the most populous city in the country nor the business center of the new country. That was Philadelphia, as you'll see on this map. But what changed all of that was the decision by some very thoughtful and forward-looking elected officials in New York to build the Erie Canal. And that canal brought access from the middle of the country. Let me just see if I can show it here. From the Great Lakes, which led into the middle of the country, down the Hudson River to New York City. And so that really was a decision that brought goods and raw materials to New York and allowed New York to become both the major port of the new country and the manufacturing center of the new country. So by the middle of the 19th century, that key investment in both canals and ultimately railroad infrastructure made New York the manufacturing center of the country as well as the hub for exports and imports. So what was established by really the first half of the 19th century were the 3 legs of New York City's economic development policy that more or less has continued to this very day, and that's diversity, both economic and demographic diversity, an emphasis on human talent. If you are talented, you'll make it in New York, and the importance of infrastructure. Now, immediately after World War II, the city had more manufacturing jobs than any other city in the United States. More than the cities that you normally think of as major industrial centers like Chicago or Detroit and St. Louis. New York was home immediately after World War II to 1 million manufacturing jobs, a third of the city's private employment at that time. But starting in the 1950s, manufacturing began a very long decline, and there was an exodus outside of the urban core and a rise in the service economy. And you can see from this slide how dramatic that has been. And with the rise of the service sector, the city's broad strategy for economic development became even more rooted in attracting people of talent from across the country and around the world to come to New York. We had to make New York into an attractive place, and generally we've been thinking about that. What are the elements that make it an attractive place change over time. But certainly among the elements that make New York an attractive place to be, at least the physical elements, are a very wide-ranging, very diverse, and very high-quality set of cultural activities, the kinds of activities that are going to attract people of talent from all over the world, very high-quality amenities like open space. Recent examples are now the very world-famous High Line and Governor's Island and Brooklyn Bridge Park, nightlife, opportunities for educational and vocational advancement, and diversity of both population and economy, and culture. Now, the work that we do in New York today evolves to evolve us into a 21st century economy, really builds on decades, indeed centuries of work to encourage growth and diversity. Unlike some American cities, and San Francisco comes to mind, which base their value proposition on limited growth, on limiting growth, we have always seen growth and diversity as part of our DNA. We haven't always been able to deliver what we believed in. I started working, as Martin said, in the early 1970s when John Lindsay was the mayor of New York City, and when urban America was trying to address a tsunami, really, of social changes, some that were great, some not so great, that at the time seemed to arise out of basically nowhere. There was a huge rise in crime in the 1960s and 1970s. There was a drug epidemic that hit the United States, and particularly our urban centers. There was a sexual revolution. Just to name a few of there was the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, just to name a few of the vast social changes that were taking place at the same time. And these collectively put enormous strains on city government. They added to the erosion of basic services. They led to a major financial crisis in the 1970s when New York effectively went bankrupt, and we saw a sharp drop in our population. And perhaps most significantly, they were a catalyst for the decline in the national government's commitment to urban America, a trend, I have to say, that has sadly pretty much continued in the United States to this very day. And meanwhile, during that period, the emerging urban development policy was essentially planned shrinkage to retreat from crime-ridden and abandoned neighborhoods, to focus principally on saving just the central business districts, and to build defensively. And indeed, some of the worst architecture, which we live with to this very day, was designed to wall off those inside from the very disagreeable aspects of urban life on the outside. But fortunately, for the last 45 years, our city has dramatically changed for the better, and the challenges we face today stem largely from our success in transforming the city's neighborhoods. And I've had the privilege of being involved in the transformation of some great neighborhoods like Times Square and Lower Manhattan. And now, with the neighborhood planning approach, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, I've had the privilege of being involved in a few more, starting with East New York and the borough of Brooklyn, and many more to come. And these transformations are driven by certain common elements, but require, as I said earlier in the panel this morning, they require strong leadership, strong elected leadership, strong bureaucratic leadership, strong leadership from the investment community, and vision. So, first, strong leadership. This is Times Square in the 1970s and 1980s. This is 42nd Street, and this is a block that in those years reported 5 serious felonies every single day. This is in the morning before many of the denizens would wake up, but in fact, this is a block that carried 8,000 people an hour at its peak. 95% of them were male because females were understandably afraid to walk on the block, and the perception of crime is much higher when there aren't basically equal numbers of men and women. And the transformation of Times Square took place over 2 decades, but it took place with 3 different mayors, 3 different governors, mayors of different parties, governors of different parties, but a willingness on their part to make a long-term investment in transforming an area, key area for the city of New York that had been an urban joke, really, recognizing that not all of the benefits would necessarily be realized during their terms. And I can't emphasize enough how important, this is a symbolic place-based effort, but how important it was to reduce over this period of time, and particularly through the late 1990s, early 2000s crime. And that was done through innovative policing, a quality of life approach to crime, increase in policing, and using land use strategies and development to reduce crime. In 1985, the precincts that made up Times Square had on the average almost 35 robberies a day. And in 2015, just to show how the world has changed in New York, there are on average less than 2 serious crimes a day in an area that encompasses close to 1 million people. And during that period, New York went from being the most dangerous city in America to the safest city in America. And here's Times Square today. It still functions as it was originally intended to function. And this, again, is an important part of vision, which is how do you build on the past? How do you take advantage of the strengths of the past in order to create a great future? Times Square was always the meeting place for New Yorkers. It was the place where New Yorkers gathered to recognize and celebrate the end of World War II. It was the place before the internet and television where New Yorkers would gather to hear election returns. And that all faded in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s. But again, this has become the meeting place, the center of New York. And the vision for Times Square was never to turn it into an antiseptic area, but rather to turn it into a populous but safe place for entertainment. And that's what's been realized here. Another area which has undergone a tremendous transformation is Lower Manhattan. Stone Street, that street that you see, I guess on the left, on your left, was the first paved street in the New World. It was paved in 1640, and for those of us who think about resiliency a lot, the reason it was paved was because it was being constantly flooded, and the property owners went to City Hall in 1640 and said, please pave the street. City Hall refused to do it, so the property owners ended up doing it themselves. I like to think that this was the first business improvement district in the New World, in a sense. But over the centuries, even though these buildings were of landmark quality, they were usually the back of functioning office buildings that had become, or functioning buildings which had retail on the ground floor, but very little above it. This was a block that was used for petty crime, for low-level drug deals, into the 1970s and 1980s, and through a combination of efforts, both by landmarking and creating an historic district here, with the cooperation of property owners, giving property tax breaks, and providing new infrastructure, this street has been transformed into a unique street in New York, a center where people in Lower Manhattan gather. And the goal here was not simply to create a nice street. The goal here was part of a larger effort to transform this neighborhood from a one-dimensional financial district, a financial district, however, that rolled up the sidewalks at 5 o'clock at night, to instead a 24/7 community that attracted residents and kept people in the downtown New York area beyond their working hours. Now, we also suffered through the tragedy in Lower Manhattan of September 11th. That picture on the left is actually of me, about an hour after the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed on September 11th. And it was daunting to think about how long and what we could do to recreate Lower Manhattan and in fact make it better. And we engaged in an intense public engagement period. We did get support from the national government for the redevelopment of the World Trade Center site and for Lower Manhattan. But the real effort was created by a public authority set up to redevelop Lower Manhattan called Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, but which engaged citizens throughout Lower Manhattan and other stakeholders, much in the way that Play the City did, and it was this exercise, Play the City Today, really is reminiscent of the engagement that we went through with the public to reimagine what the World Trade Center site should be. And I'm proud to say that the complex on the right is now almost complete, less than 15 years later, less than 13 years after the site stopped being a crime site and essentially a cemetery. And Lower Manhattan has now been transformed for the better. Here are 4 other examples of using economic development and city involvement to transform the economy of the city. In the upper left is Hudson Yards, currently the largest private real estate development project in the history of the United States. It covers 28 acres of rail yards, and it's an innovative collaboration between the city, the state of New York, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which owns the rail yards, and private developers, and is already, first building opened last week, going to result in 17 million square feet of space, both commercial and residential space. Again, the goal of creating a new 24/7 community. We'll have 4,000 new apartments. It will have shops. It will have a school. It is also innovative because of its financing, which is using a form of tax increment financing where the city is forgiving property taxes, and those taxes instead are being funneled in to create a new transportation station, a $1 billion extension of a subway line to make this neighborhood viable. And if you were here yesterday, you heard Michael Kimmelman talk about this as one of the only new station that was actually built in the last 65 years in New York, compared to some 100 in one city in China in the last 5 years. That's not exactly accurate. We've actually built 4 subway stations in the last 65 years, but his point is well taken. But now we are using innovative financing to do it. The Brooklyn Navy Yard, which was the arsenal for Navy ships in World War II and lay dormant for decades, is now becoming a center for manufacturing and creative manufacturing, fashion, life sciences, green manufacturers of products like wind and solar street lamps, and 21st century food manufacturing. There are buildings here that are creating public food manufacturing hubs on the ground floor, and some buildings, Dock 72 building, which I think is highlighted on this slide, where collaborative office space is being created by WeWork. I don't know if you have WeWork in the Czech Republic or in Prague, but no, it is now in several European cities as well as in American cities, a collaborative workspace. And this has become such a popular center for creative businesses, for creative and new manufacturing businesses and advanced manufacturing, that it has created for New York a paradox, because it has made this area attractive to even office tenants. A major advertising firm is now seeking to locate its headquarters here, and that would push up rents, make the neighborhood more expensive for the kinds of manufacturing we like to maintain, but it's both an example of its success and a worrisome issue that we have to monitor and watch to make sure it doesn't become too successful. Before I get to Cornell Technion, 25 Kent Avenue is a new approach that we've taken at the Planning Commission, using land use as an incentive for creating new businesses. This is a manufacturing area on our Brooklyn waterfront. We haven't seen brand new manufacturing space in New York City of any size in decades. But what we've done here is incentivize the developer by allowing that developer to build more office space in return for a requirement that it also build a certain amount of manufacturing space and industrial space as well. We've just approved this. It is going through the final stages of the city's public approval process. But if this works out, because we view it as an experiment, it may be a new model for encouraging new kinds of industrial space. And then in the lower left is Cornell Technion, which is, I have to say, one of Mayor Bloomberg's most impressive initiatives, and really recognize that the city can't just stand on its laurels, because despite the overall talent that we attract to New York, our major businesses told us that they weren't able to compete with Silicon Valley in growing, retaining, or attracting high talent engineers. We have some great universities in New York, two of which I've taught at, Columbia University and New York University. They're wonderful universities, but they don't match in their ability to produce super high-end engineers that our franchise businesses really demanded. So the city decided to enter into a competition, designed a competition, to create a world-class school that would produce world-class engineering talent. And it offered on Roosevelt Island, which is in the middle of the East River, between Queens and Manhattan, and you can get there by either aerial tram for 5 minutes or get there by subway at one of the other 3 stations that Michael Kimmelman didn't mention, but was built in the 1970s, and Roosevelt Island has been a residential community for the last 30 years. But the city offered free land and $100 million if a world-class university would create a graduate engineering program somewhere in the city. It wasn't required to do it here. The winner was Cornell University and Technion, Israeli Technion, as a joint venture. I was particularly proud of this because I both live on Roosevelt Island and I'm a graduate of Cornell University, so I was really happy to see this develop. And this is now under construction. It will open officially next year. But it's already operating out of a Google building in Manhattan, and it has already spun off, just as we hoped it would, 20 new businesses and 200 graduates just in the last year. The vast majority of those graduates are staying in New York. So we've actually now producing, in a different way than we had in the past, our own talent. And we expect as this campus opens next year, it will produce thousands of new jobs and inject billions of dollars into our economy. So speaking of jobs, New York has never been stronger economically. Our jobs are at an all-time high, almost 4.3 million jobs in the city as of the most recent count in February. We have added more than 250,000 jobs since January 2014. That's the fastest growth rate in the city's history. Our unemployment rate is way down, and our jobs are diversifying across both industries and where they're located geographically. The diversity of our economy underscores, I think, our economic resiliency. We used to be extraordinarily dependent first on manufacturing at the end of World War II, then on financial services, and our economy would bounce up and down depending on how the financial services markets were doing. We have really diversified our economy through many efforts, including some of the ones I just mentioned, over the past several years. And we believe that this diversity not only is good for people who need jobs, skilled and unskilled, but also provide a cushion against inevitable business cycles. Almost 24% of our jobs now are in healthcare and education, some at the very high end, and this is followed by over 650,000 jobs, which include much of the growing creative, technical, and innovative workforce, legal services, design services, media, advertising, architecture. This corresponds well to a very big increase in our highly educated residents and the growth of the tech sector. And this has been matched, maybe this has fueled, our population growth. Our city's population has never been larger. Current estimates show that our population crossed 8.5 million people in 2015. That's the largest in our history, and our city, our total city population is greater than 40 of the 50 U.S. states, and 4 out of our 5 boroughs, Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Manhattan, obviously, would each separately rank among the 10 largest cities in America. We've added 375,000 people to the city in the last 5 years alone, which is really remarkable. But that really doesn't, I think, tell really the story. Over 3 million of our 8.5 million residents are foreign-born, and 40% of them arrived since the year 2000, so over the last 15 years. And perhaps one of the most remarkable things about New York City is that half of all New Yorkers now speak a language other than English at home. The percentage of households in Prague that speak English at home may even be higher than the percentage of households in New York that speak English at home. Most notably, our Asian and Hispanic populations have dramatically increased. They account now for more than 80% of the city's population growth. We have 2.4 million Hispanics, more than any other city in the United States, and we're home to the largest Chinese population outside of Asia. And you can see the top 20 countries that provide immigrants to New York. And much of this is a diverse economy that attracts people of talent. But a lot of this is also people coming here simply for opportunity who are unskilled, people coming here because of oppression and political challenges from their home country. But I think there's a lot of things that can be said about New York that make it attractive and great, but for me, foremost among them is that people from around the world can feel at home here. And let me just emphasize that this is not just sort of a good feeling kind of a thing, or a moral kind of a thing, or even just that it's, we've always done it. But it is essential for our economy, and it's essential to attract people of talent, for our ability to attract people of talent. If Columbia University or New York University wants to attract a Sri Lankan professor, one of our selling points is that there's a Sri Lankan community in New York where that professor can feel at home. And that's true with at least 100 different nationalities. And that's the diversity of the city. And in today's world, that diversity is also important in our economy because for the most part now, we have people who, where if you're attracting someone, you're not just attracting that professor, you're generally also attracting that professor's partner who has his or her own career, maybe a violinist, maybe an artist, maybe an architect. And there's got to be opportunities for that partner as well. And so the idea of demographic diversity and economic diversity work together. But while we're extremely proud of this, and we're extremely proud of our diversity both economically and demographically, and while beyond simply attracting talent, this has always injects an entrepreneurial spirit into the city, this growth has brought with it challenges, and challenges that are not familiar to any city that is growing, including, and especially for New York, a tough issue, the growing inequality between the rich and everybody else. A persistently high poverty rate. 20% of New York's population is poor. An additional 20% are near poor. And frankly, the needle for that 40% hasn't moved that much over the last few decades, despite New York's overall success. And so we have a growing population that's competing for supply of housing that simply isn't growing as quickly. In centrally located neighborhoods with strong access to jobs and other amenities, incomes are rising, but rents are rising even faster. And even in neighborhoods where incomes are not rising, the demand for housing is pushing rents up. And in New York City, we currently have every single night 55,000 people sleeping in homeless shelters, which is really unacceptable for a civilized society. And as Mimi Hong mentioned this morning, we have countless numbers of families who are doubled up in overcrowded conditions. So, and the growth also has created pressure on our city's very dense but aging infrastructure and transportation system. So more people than ever before need affordable housing and career-building jobs in order to pay for housing in growing innovative sectors. So the city, so New Yorkers from across the economic spectrum can all participate in the city's successes. And if we are to continue the trajectory we're on, we have to build more housing, and we have to build more affordable housing. So when Mayor de Blasio took office in January 14th, he made the production of affordable housing his #1 priority. And you can see at least one compelling reason why. We have close to 1 million households who are extremely low and very low income renter households, and fewer than 450,000 units of rental housing that they can afford that exist in the city. A majority of New York City households rent, and 2/3 of New York City households rent. And of those 2/3 that rent, a majority are rent burdened, which means they're spending 1/3 or more of their household income on rent. And that means that they have very little left for anything else. So the mayor charged us with creating a housing program, a very ambitious housing program, and said he would put the city's resources behind it. And he has. So the city has now committed $8.2 billion in capital money to build affordable housing, bring down the cost of building housing in our 10-year capital plan. That's $8.2 billion over 10 years. And that is double the commitment made during the Bloomberg years for the previous 10 years. And we've had this plan in operation now for 2 years, and we have already financed and underway more than 40,000 units of affordable housing since January 2014, and so we're on schedule to meet a very ambitious goal. But we've also, he charged us with coming up with other innovative ways that we can support affordable housing. And so we've adopted a number of different approaches. One that I am particularly proud of is called mandatory inclusionary zoning, so that any time that we create through zoning, more housing capacity. 25 to 30% of that housing is required to be affordable. Not necessarily subsidized by the government. It's got to be affordable or a developer can't build in that area. 25% set aside for affordability means for very low-income people, and 30% affordability means for moderately low-income and moderate-income people. Most developers so far are selecting the 25% option, which from our perspective is very good. We've also committed $1 billion to neighborhoods where we're increasing housing capacity. And we're looking at neighborhoods throughout the city in a very different way than we have in the past. We are committed by the mayor to looking at least 15 neighborhoods in the city where we think housing capacity can be increased dramatically. We've identified already 7 of those neighborhoods. We'll have many more than 15 ultimately. And the first neighborhood plan that we identified is in East New York, which was just approved a few months ago. So this approach to neighborhood planning is something very different for New York. It's not a top-down planning, it's really more a bottom-up planning. When we looked at East New York, which was one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, we recognized that we'd have to undertake a comprehensive approach to neighborhood revitalization. And I keep saying to the staff at city planning that zoning is just one tool. Design is another tool. We need to deploy a host of tools comprehensively if we're going to change the way neighborhoods both feel, the quality of neighborhoods, and frankly, the way neighborhoods react, how neighborhoods feel about change. Neighborhoods are really worried in New York, which is a pretty dense city. They're concerned about density. They're concerned about it for lots of good reasons and some not so good reasons. But among the reasons that they're appropriately concerned about it is, will the public investments that are required to accommodate a new and growing population be there? And there's a history in New York of not always meeting the promises that are made that they will be there. And that's why we created a separate fund of $1 billion just for the neighborhoods that we're looking at. So this is Atlantic Avenue, one of the most dangerous streets in New York, a street that's very wide that divides 2 parts of East New York, and a street that is, for the most part, doesn't allow housing on it currently. It's mostly for old automotive repair shops, if that. Doesn't have any significant jobs, doesn't have any retail. And this is the street that divides East New York. And this is the vision of what we hope to change Atlantic Avenue into over the next year or two, with new schools, access to parks, new affordable housing, and the like. But the way we went about this is, I think, instructive and very, very different. You'll see a bunch of various components to our planning in East New York. We started not by saying, here's our plan. We started by engaging with the local community, what their needs were, what they needed, what they wanted, what the community board wanted, what the local elected city council member wanted. And we meshed that. It was very heated at times. It went over a course of a year. There were concerns about density. There were concerns about new and different people moving into the neighborhood. But we ultimately came up with a result that we believe makes everybody satisfied, if not everybody 100% thrilled. But at least we had a very engaged process with the community, so we can say, look, we really listen to you. And so the changes that we are making in East New York include pedestrian and safety improvements along Atlantic Avenue, a tremendously dangerous street, new open space and enhanced open space and new parks, a new community center for neighborhood youth, introduction of broadband in a neighborhood that never had it before, a 1,000-seat public school with new affordable housing next to it, a greater influence of the community and planning on our overall city 10-year capital plan. And I should just make a note here that 45 years ago, the planning department and the city's budget office jointly created the 10-year capital strategy for the city. And then when New York went through a fiscal crisis in the 1970s, the city fathers, I would say city fathers and mothers, but there really weren't any mothers in those days. It was just city fathers, wrote the planning commission out of the 10-year capital plan. The 10-year capital plan became simply a budget document, a fiscal control document, not a planning document, which is what a strategy should be. And now we are once again working together with budget so that it becomes both a planning document and a fiscal financial control document, and so that we can allocate our resources where we think growth is likely to occur. And again, as this neighborhood and every one of our neighborhoods, we sort of have to start with what's our vision, what's the community's vision for a neighborhood, and how do we jointly address issues of citywide concern as well as issues of neighborhood concern. They're not always the same, but hopefully they overlap over time. And we believe in East New York we've done that. The vision will be very different in other neighborhoods, but we hope the process of engagement and the deployment of a variety of different skills, a variety of different components, a variety of different investments, as well as zoning tools, as well as incentives to build housing will remain. And in East New York, we expect to see some 7,000 affordable housing units over the next few years. Finally, I do want to say a word about our 10-year plan, just having heard a bit about it this morning. Our 10-year plan is based on, and builds on top of the work that Mayor Bloomberg did during his administration, builds on really four goals: growth, equity, resiliency, and sustainability. And what we've done is not only say these are our visions, but under each of these we have, and this is our vision for the next 10, 20 years. It's always adjusted every year. But under each of these, collectively now, we have listed 200 different very explicit initiatives, very explicit things that the city is committed to do, and which department in the city is committed to doing it. We issue an annual report that specifies exactly how far we've come on each of those initiatives. We issued our first last April. 95% of the initiatives we said that we would undertake are underway, or some of them already enacted. And we publicly report progress both on city website as well as in our engagement with the community with very, very specific metrics. And I would just add that a fifth goal here, although not explicitly mentioned here, is citizen engagement. And we're engaging with our citizens in a very different way than we had in the past. We engage through formal face-to-face meetings, through community boards and the like, but we're also engaging increasingly on social media. We're also engaging increasingly through other IT means. And this, for us, is a very important means of not only having our citizens tell us what is wrong with the city and what we have to fix, but also a way for us to engage with citizens in a variety of different ways. And so we're going to continue to our work to cohesively and coherently try to address the challenges of growth and equity, Sustainability and resiliency. Resiliency is a very big issue for New York in the traditional sense because we are a coastal city and we have to deal with the issues of a rising sea level and global warming, as many cities do. But we also have to think about resiliency in the broader sense, as was discussed earlier today, and how we provide for the resiliency of our citizens. And I think that all of us really live through a time of extraordinary change, and that's affecting our planet in so many exciting ways, and we have to be nimble enough to change with them, with that change. The change is coming. We can't deny it. We have to harness it and use it as best we can, and we will do that. And just to give you a sense of what's next on the horizon, this is the Long Island City waterfront. This is an old industrial area that we want to turn into a mixed-use area for housing, for industrial use, for office use, for creative businesses. See if we can put them all in one place. And this will require zoning, it will require tax incentives, it will require transportation improvements, it will require capital investments. But if we can put them all together, we think this is the neighborhood of the future, and that in the background beyond those buildings is Roosevelt Island, and our expectation is as jobs and businesses are spun off from Cornell Technion, this will be where they will relocate. So with that, I will stop and hopefully answer questions or whatever. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. That's really good.